Have you ever felt like life was falling apart, only to realize later that it was actually guiding you somewhere important? Ethan had always believed that life could be controlled. He built his world around structure, routines, and predictability. There was a sense of security in knowing what came next. Every morning, he woke up at the same time, made his coffee just the way he liked it, and read the newspaper in the quiet comfort of his home. His wife, Margaret, would often hum softly as she prepared breakfast, filling the house with warmth. That made life feel steady, unshakable. But life, as Ethan would painfully learn, did not always follow a plan. Margaret's passing was sudden. One day she was there, smiling at him over the rim of her teacup, and the next, she was gone. Just like that. No warning. No chance to prepare. The world he had carefully built collapsed in an instant. At first, he tried to hold on to his routines, believing that if he just kept going, if he just followed the same steps, everything would somehow feel normal again. But the house was too quiet. The coffee was too bitter. The mornings felt endless, and the nights were the worst. He would reach for her in the darkness, only to grasp at empty sheets. The world moved forward, but Ethan remained stuck. One crisp autumn afternoon, he found himself at the park, one of the many places he and Margaret used to visit together. He hadn't planned to come here. His feet had simply carried him, as if drawn by an old habit he couldn't quite shake. He sat on a worn wooden bench, the same one they used to share, and watched as golden leaves drifted to the ground. The air was cool, carrying the scent of damp earth and distant chimney smoke. Around him, life continued. An elderly couple strolled past, hands intertwined, their steps slow but steady. A little boy ran ahead of his father, kicking up a flurry of leaves, his laughter ringing through the crisp air. A woman sat nearby, reading a book, her expression calm and content. Ethan watched it all unfold, yet he felt invisible, like a man who no longer belonged in this world. And then, a thought surfaced in his mind, one that he had never considered before. What if pain isn't here to break us, but to teach us? He wasn't sure where the question came from. Maybe it was the rustling of the leaves, whispering their quiet wisdom. Maybe it was the sight of the elderly couple, a reminder of the love he once had. Or maybe, just maybe, it was Margaret nudging him from somewhere beyond. Could it be that this pain, this unbearable loss, wasn't meant to destroy him, but to lead him somewhere new? He exhaled slowly, watching his breath dissolve into the autumn air. If you've ever questioned why life unfolds the way it does, stay with me. This story might change the way you see everything. And if this story resonates with you, if you've ever felt lost, if you've ever struggled to make sense of the unexpected, consider supporting this channel. Together, we can find meaning in life's uncertainties and maybe, just maybe, discover a path forward. The hidden purpose of pain: don't resist. Learn from it. Ethan spent months trying to outrun his grief. He told himself that if he just kept moving, if he just filled his days with enough activity, the pain would fade into the background. He busied himself with meaningless tasks, organizing the garage, trimming the hedges, scrubbing the kitchen counters until they shone. He went on long walks, hoping that if he exhausted his body, his mind would quiet down. But no matter how much he tried to distract himself, the emptiness always crept back. At night, when the world slowed down and there was nothing left to do, he would lie awake, staring at the ceiling. The silence in the house felt heavier than ever. And in that stillness, the same question echoed over and over in his mind. Why is this happening to me? No matter how many times he asked, there was no answer. Only the weight of his own sorrow, pressing down on him, making every breath feel like an effort. He felt like a small boat caught in a raging storm, fighting against the waves with everything he had. He paddled furiously, desperate to stay afloat, but the harder he fought, the more exhausted he became. And still, the storm raged on. One afternoon, after another restless night, Ethan found himself at a Buddhist meditation center he had passed by many times but never entered. He wasn't sure what had drawn him there. Perhaps desperation, perhaps something deeper that he couldn't yet name. Inside, the air was calm, scented with sandalwood. An elderly monk sat before a small group of people, speaking in a gentle, measured voice. Ethan hesitated at the doorway, but the monk noticed him and smiled, motioning for him to come closer. Ethan sat at the back, listening as a young man in the group began to speak. "Master," the young man said, his voice heavy with frustration, "why is life so unfair? No matter how hard I try, I always end up suffering. I don't understand why things keep going wrong." The monk nodded, as if he had heard this question 1,000 times before. He reached down and scooped up a handful of sand from a bowl beside him. "Hold out your hand," he instructed. The young man did as he was told, and the monk slowly poured the sand into his open palm. "Now, hold on to it tightly," the monk said. The young man clenched his fist around the sand. But as he squeezed, the grains slipped through his fingers, falling back into the bowl. No matter how hard he tried to keep them, the more he struggled, the more the sand escaped his grasp. "The more you resist," the monk said softly, "the more you suffer." Ethan felt something shift inside him. He had spent months trying to fight against his grief, trying to force it into submission. But like the sand, the more he resisted, the more his suffering deepened. For the first time, he considered a different approach. What if pain wasn't the enemy? What if it was a teacher? That night, Ethan didn't try to distract himself. He didn't busy his hands with chores or drown his thoughts in meaningless activity. Instead, he sat in the quiet of his home and allowed himself to simply feel. The grief was still there, raw and heavy. But as he stopped resisting it, something unexpected happened. He noticed it in a new way. It wasn't just pain. It was love. It was every moment he had spent with Margaret, every memory, every laugh, every touch. His sorrow wasn't just the absence of her. It was proof of how deeply he had loved her. That he closed his eyes, breathing deeply, and for the first time in a long time, he let the waves carry him. Pain was not there to destroy him. It was there to guide him, and perhaps, if he listened closely, it would show him the way forward. No change, no growth, except to evolve. One morning, as golden sunlight filtered through his window, Ethan felt something stir inside him. A quiet urge, a whisper of something new. He had spent so long trapped in grief, lost in the memories of the past. But now, there was a small voice within him, telling him it was time to step outside the walls he had built around himself. And so, for the first time in months, Ethan packed a small bag and set out on a journey that he had heard about. A small Buddhist monastery in the countryside, a place known for its peace and wisdom. He wasn't sure what he was looking for. Maybe answers, maybe healing, or maybe just a moment of stillness in a world that had felt so chaotic. When he arrived, the monastery was exactly as he had imagined. Simple, quiet, surrounded by tall trees that swayed gently in the breeze. A few monks moved silently through the stone paths, their robes flowing as they carried out their daily tasks. An elderly monk sat on the steps of the temple, watching the sky. His face was weathered but peaceful, his eyes filled with a wisdom that seemed to see through time itself. Ethan approached hesitantly, unsure of what to say. The monk smiled and motioned for him to sit. They sat in silence for a while, the only sound being the distant chirping of birds and the rustling of leaves. Then, without a word, the monk pointed to a small lake nearby. "Tell me," the monk said softly, "what do you see?" Ethan followed his gaze. The water was still, a perfect mirror reflecting the sky above. It was peaceful, untouched. The monk handed Ethan a small stone. "Throw it into the lake." Ethan hesitated but did as he was told. The stone made a soft plop as it hit the water, and ripples began to spread outward, one after another, until they reached the shore. "Pain is like this ripple," the monk said, his voice calm. "You cannot stop it from forming, but you can choose how you see it." Ethan watched the ripples until they faded, the water slowly returning to its original stillness. Something about that moment reminded him of his own life, the moments of loss, the unexpected changes, the way one event could send waves through everything he knew. He thought back to the time he had lost his job in his early 40s. At the time, he had been devastated. He had defined himself by his work, by his sense of stability. But losing that job had forced him onto a different path, one that led him to teaching. He had discovered a passion for helping others learn, something he never would have found if life had gone according to plan. He thought of an old friend he had once been close to, someone he had lost due to anger and pride. For years, they had been like brothers. But then, a misunderstanding had turned into silence, and silence had turned into a permanent distance. When his friend passed away unexpectedly, Ethan had been filled with regret. He had spent so much time holding on to resentment, not realizing that forgiveness was always within his reach. Life had changed him in so many ways, and each loss, each struggle, had shaped the person he had become. The monk continued, breaking Ethan's thoughts. Do you know the story of the butterfly? Ethan shook his head. There was once a man who saw a butterfly struggling to break free from its cocoon. The monk said, his eyes glimmering with quiet wisdom. Feeling sorry for it, he carefully cut open the cocoon to help. But when the butterfly emerged, its wings were weak. It could not fly. What the man didn't realize was that the struggle was necessary. It was through the struggle that the butterfly's wings grew strong enough to soar. Ethan felt his breath catch. He understood. His pain was not a punishment. His suffering was not meaningless. Every hardship he had endured was shaping him, strengthening him, helping him grow. For so long, he had resisted change, just as he had resisted his grief. But maybe, just maybe, if he embraced it instead, if he allowed himself to learn from it, he would find something beautiful on the other side. He looked out at the lake one more time, watching as the last of the ripples disappeared. And for the first time in a long time, he felt something like peace. Dharma, the invisible order of life. Ethan had spent his whole life trying to control the world around him. He believed in logic, in cause and effect, in carefully laid out plans. But life had never cared for his expectations. It had taken Margaret from him when he least expected, had shaken him with losses and forced him onto unfamiliar paths. And yet, sitting in the quiet of the monastery, he felt something shift within him. Maybe things didn't happen randomly. Maybe there was a rhythm to life, a deeper order he had never noticed before. One afternoon, he sat with the old monk again. The autumn sun filtered through the trees, painting the ground in golden light. Ethan had begun to find comfort in these conversations, in the quiet wisdom of the man before him. Tell me, the monk said, his voice gentle, do you believe life is chaotic? Ethan hesitated. It certainly feels that way sometimes. The monk nodded knowingly. Let me tell you a story. The man lost in the forest. There was once a man who got lost in a dense forest. He wandered for hours, desperately searching for a way out. Every turn led him deeper into the unknown. Every path twisted in ways he didn't expect. The more he struggled, the more lost he became. Finally, exhausted, he collapsed onto the ground. He had no more strength left to fight. And then, he heard a soft trickling sound. A stream. For the first time, he stopped moving. He simply listened. And as he followed the sound, he discovered a small brook, winding its way through the trees. He walked alongside it, allowing it to guide him. And before long, it led him out of the forest. The monk paused, then looked at Ethan. Sometimes, the only way to find your path is to stop fighting and start trusting. Ethan felt the weight of those words settle deep in his heart. He had spent so much of his life resisting, trying to force things into place, trying to control every outcome. But what if peace wasn't found in resistance? What if it was found in surrender? The falling leafy breeze rustled through the trees, and Ethan's eyes followed a single golden leaf as it detached from a branch. It floated gently downward, twisting and turning, carried effortlessly by the wind. The leaf did not fight. It did not resist. It simply let go. And in that moment, Ethan understood. For so long, he had grieved Margaret's death as if it were a mistake, as if life had done something cruel to him. He had fought against his pain, struggled to make sense of it. But perhaps it had all happened exactly as it was meant to. Life had taken Margaret from him, but it had also brought him here. To this monastery, to this wisdom, to this realization. There was an invisible order to everything. A leaf did not fall before its time. A river did not carve its path without reason. The tides rose and fell, the seasons changed, and everything in nature moved in harmony. Why should his life be any different? Letting go of control, Ethan inhaled deeply, filling his lungs with the crisp autumn air. He was tired of fighting, tired of resisting what had already happened. For the first time in a long time, he let go. And in that surrender, he felt something he hadn't in years: peace. The illusion of control. Let go to find freedom. For most of his life, Ethan believed that if he planned carefully, if he made the right decisions, if he just controlled things well enough, he could keep pain at bay. He built his life on routines, structure, and predictability, convinced that certainty would protect him. But life had never followed his plans, and Margaret's death had shattered every illusion of control he had ever held. No amount of preparation, no amount of careful planning had been able to stop it. And for months, he had wrestled with that truth, feeling as if he had failed to keep life steady, failed to hold on to the world as he had known it. Yet, the more he tried to regain that control, the more he felt like he was drowning, that he worried constantly about the future, about growing old alone, about what would happen next. Control had never brought him peace. It had only filled his mind with fear. One evening, he sat with the old monk by the lake, watching the water ripple under the evening breeze. He finally spoke the thought that had been weighing on him. "I've spent my whole life trying to keep things from falling apart," Ethan admitted. "But no matter what I do, life keeps changing. People leave, things go wrong. How do I stop it?" The monk chuckled softly. "You cannot." Ethan looked up, surprised by the simplicity of the answer. The monk picked up a stick and drew a line in the sand before him. Then, with one swift motion, he ran his hand through it, erasing the line completely. "This is life," the monk said. "You can try to draw your plans, but the world will always move as it wishes." The king who tried to stop the river there was once a powerful king, the monk continued, who lived by a great river. He loved his kingdom, but he hated the way the river flooded unpredictably, washing away homes and crops. So he decided to control it. That he gathered the best architects, the strongest builders, and commanded them to build a massive wall to stop the river from overflowing. For a time, it worked. The water was blocked. The land remained dry. But rivers do not obey walls. Slowly, the water found small cracks, slipping through, seeping underneath. And then, one day, the pressure became too great. The wall collapsed, and the flood was worse than ever before. The king learned a painful lesson that day. You cannot stop the flow of life. You can only learn to move with it. Ethan exhaled, slowly, letting the story sink in. That he had spent his entire life trying to build walls, believing that if he just controlled enough, planned enough, he could keep suffering out. But pain had found its way through anyway. Loss had come. Change had come. No matter how strong his walls were, life had moved in its own direction. And perhaps that wasn't a mistake. Letting the river flow, the monk pointed at the lake before them. The water does not fight to stay still. It moves as the wind moves, as the land allows. That is why it is at peace. Ethan watched the ripples dance across the surface. For the first time, he saw it clearly. Happiness was never found in control. It was found in trust. In trusting that even when life changed, even when it didn't go as planned, it was still flowing exactly as it was meant to. He had spent so long fearing change, trying to hold on to things that were always meant to shift. But what if, instead of resisting, he simply let go? The thought didn't terrify him anymore. It freed him. Peace in the unexpected. Accept and live fully. Ethan returned home from the monastery with a lighter heart, but the world around him remained the same. The house was still filled with quiet echoes of Margaret, the scent of her favorite lavender candle lingering in the air, the neatly folded blanket she once wrapped herself in, the framed photographs capturing moments that now felt like another lifetime. Yet, something inside him had shifted. For so long, he had resisted change, gripping onto the illusion of control, believing that if he just tried hard enough, he could keep things from slipping away. But now, he saw it differently. Life was not something to be tamed or controlled. It was meant to be lived in all its unpredictability. And so, Ethan made a choice. That he no longer tried to fill his days with distractions or force meaning where there was none. Instead, he let life unfold as it wished. He found himself embracing small joys, chatting with the woman at the bakery, feeding the birds on his morning walks, feeling the crisp autumn air on his skin without rushing to be anywhere. He even started teaching. Again, not in a classroom, but in the small library downtown where children gathered for afternoon reading sessions. The first time he read aloud, his voice trembling slightly, he felt Margaret beside him, not in a painful, longing way, but in the warmth of a memory well lived. She would have loved this. There were still moments of sadness. Grief did not vanish, nor did loneliness. Some evenings, He would catch himself reaching for an extra cup of tea before remembering there was no one else to drink it. Some nights, the silence felt heavier than others. But now, he let those feelings come and go, like waves on the shore, neither clinging to them nor pushing them away. One evening, as the sky melted into hues of gold and deep crimson, Ethan sat on his porch, a cup of warm tea cradled in his hands. He watched the sun dip behind the trees, painting the world in fleeting colors. The air carried the scent of damp earth, and a gentle breeze rustled the branches. For a moment, he simply breathed, and then a small smile touched his lips. There was no need to hold on to this moment, no need to fear its passing. It was enough just to be here, to witness, to feel, to exist. Margaret had once told him that the most beautiful things in life were the ones that could not be kept. A sunset, a breath of wind, a moment of laughter. They arrived, they passed, and yet they stayed within us in ways that mattered. Ethan finally understood. He was no longer afraid of what tomorrow would bring. He was no longer weighed down by what had already passed. For the first time in a long time, he was simply here, alive, present, and that was enough. A message to you. If life feels uncertain, remember, every moment is leading you somewhere. Let go, trust the journey, and embrace the lessons. And if this message touched your heart, consider subscribing. Let's walk this path together.